It started the way these things always do, with something seemingly harmless. The antique shop sat on the edge of town, buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. I remember the smell when we walked in, that old, musky scent of forgotten objects and time-worn memories. My wife, Julia, had always loved these places. She said every object had a story, as though the essence of their previous owners clung to them. I always rolled my eyes, but she would insist. That day, though, it was my daughter, Emily, who found the mirror. "Look, Daddy," she called out, her small voice reverberating in the dim room. She stood in front of it, her hands clasped behind her back, like she'd discovered a treasure. The mirror was tall and regal, nearly 7 feet high, and its frame was carved from dark, gnarled wood, oak, maybe, though I'm no expert. It twisted in strange patterns, swirls that looked almost alive. The glass was clean despite its age, clearer than it should have been, and yet, something about it made me pause. "Creepy, isn't it?" I muttered under my breath. Julia smirked. "It's beautiful. It'll be perfect for the hallway." I glanced at the price tag. $50. Cheap for something that looked like it belonged in a haunted mansion. Why is it so inexpensive? The shopkeeper, a frail old man with cataract-clouded eyes, suddenly appeared beside us. I swear I didn't even hear him approach. "Oh, that mirror? Special price for you. No returns." "No returns?" I repeated, suspicious. He waved a bony hand. "Once you see, you can't unsee. That's all I'll say." Julia gave me her "don't embarrass me" look and bought it on the spot. We hung the mirror in the upstairs hallway that same night. It fit perfectly against the faded wallpaper, like it had always been there. Standing before it, I had to admit, it really was striking. The glass seemed deeper than any mirror I'd ever seen, almost like you could fall into it if you leaned close enough. Emily loved it. She stood in front of it that first night, twirling in her pajamas. "It's magic, Daddy." I smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's right, kiddo. A magic mirror for a magic girl." Later that night, I passed by the hallway on my way to the bedroom. Julia was already asleep, and the house was dark and still. But as I walked past the mirror, I thought I saw something. I stopped. I turned back to face it, feeling foolish. Just my reflection. Same tired face. Same worn-out clothes. But as I leaned in closer, a chill crawled up my spine. The hallway behind me, in the mirror, looked darker than it should have. Shadowy. Almost too shadowy. Like someone stood just out of view, cloaked in darkness. I spun around. The hallway was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and everything seemed normal again. Just me. My reflection staring back. I shook my head. "I'm losing it," I muttered, and went to bed. The next day, things were fine. Mostly. Emily played in her room, Julia fussed with decorations, and I worked in my office. But something gnawed at the edges of my mind. That mirror. Every time I walked past it, I had to glance at it. Every single time. It was like it demanded attention. That afternoon, as I passed it yet again, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something wrong with my reflection. I was standing completely still, but my reflection shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A slight tilt of the head. A blink I didn't make. And then, a smile crept across its face. I didn't smile. I swear I didn't. My heart dropped into my stomach. I blinked, and everything was normal again. My reflection looked back at me, blank and unthreatening. "Dad?" Emily's voice snapped me out of it. She stood behind me, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Why are you staring at it like that?" I forced a laugh. "Just spacing out, kiddo. Come on, let's go see what Mom's up to." But as I turned to leave, I glanced at the mirror one last time. My reflection was still smiling. That night, I couldn't sleep. Julia snored softly beside me, and the house was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I sat up, rubbing my face, and glanced toward the bedroom door. From where I sat, I could just make out the edge of the hallway, and the mirror. It stood there, shrouded in darkness, but somehow I knew it was awake. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and padded into the hallway, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The mirror loomed before me, its frame twisted and sinister. I stepped closer. The glass was black. Completely black, like an open doorway to nothing. I leaned in, my breath fogging up the surface. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dark. And then, a face appeared. It wasn't mine. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The mouth opened wider. Wider. Like it was screaming, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving. But when I looked again, the mirror was normal. Just my reflection staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. "Daddy?" Emily's voice startled me. She stood in the doorway to her room, her bunny clutched to her chest. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "What are you doing awake?" "I heard you talking to someone," she said softly. I froze. "I wasn't talking to anyone, honey. Go back to bed." She stared at the mirror for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she turned and padded back to her room without another word. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, I stood in front of the mirror again. The daylight should have made it less ominous, but it didn't. The reflection that looked back at me felt off. It was like watching an actor pretending to be me. The expression was too still. The eyes lingered too long on mine. I didn't tell Julia. I wanted to, but what was I supposed to say? "Hey, honey, I think the mirror you bought might be haunted, and my reflection is acting weird?" She'd laugh me off. I wasn't ready for that, not yet. Emily, however, seemed different that morning. Quiet. Pensive. She sat at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around with her spoon. "You okay, kiddo?" I asked. She nodded without looking up. "I don't like the mirror." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" "It's scary." "Why's it scary?" She shrugged, staring down into her bowl. "I see things in it." I knelt beside her. "What kind of things, Emily?" Her little lips pursed as if she were afraid to tell me. "People." I swallowed hard. "People?" She nodded again. "People that don't live here." I glanced at Julia, who was busy fussing with the dishwasher, oblivious to the conversation. I kept my voice soft. "When do you see them?" She looked at me then, her eyes wide. "When I look too long. They're in the hallway." A chill ran through me. "Okay, kiddo," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's stay away from the mirror for now, okay? It's just an old piece of junk." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and hopped off her chair, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. That evening, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That the things I'd seen were just tricks of the light. A tired brain playing games. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Julia and Emily were in the living room watching TV while I worked late in my office. The quiet hum of their voices should have been comforting, but all I could think about was the mirror. I could feel it, like a pulse in the house. I don't know what compelled me, but eventually, I stood up and walked out into the hallway. The mirror loomed in the dark like a sentry guarding some ancient secret. I stood in front of it, staring into the glass. My reflection stared back. "You're not real," I whispered. The reflection tilted its head ever so slightly, so subtly that I almost didn't see it. My heart thudded in my chest. "What do you want?" The reflection didn't answer, but behind it, in the dark hallway inside the mirror, I saw something move. A shadow. No, a figure. It stepped closer. I could make out its shape now. A man, tall and thin, with limbs that were too long and too rigid. His face was shrouded in darkness, but I could see his mouth. A thin, black grin. He raised one hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass, like he was testing it. Like he wanted to step through. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "Daddy!" The whisper came from behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the man was gone. My reflection looked normal again. "Jesus," I muttered, my voice trembling. I rubbed my face, trying to shake the fear off. But then I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from Emily's room. I sprinted down the hall and pushed her door open. Emily sat upright in bed, wide awake, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her arms. "Daddy," she said, her voice small. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" She pointed to the corner of her room. "He's in here." My stomach dropped. "Who's in here?" She didn't say anything. She just kept pointing. I followed her finger to the far corner, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. For a moment, I saw nothing. Just an empty corner. But then, the shadows shifted. A figure stood there, tall and still, its face hidden in the dark. The same man from the mirror. I grabbed Emily and backed away toward the door. "Julia!" I shouted. "Julia, get in here." The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, studying us. Its head tilted just slightly, like my reflection had earlier. Julia burst into the room moments later, her face pale with confusion. "What's going on?" I turned to her. "There's someone in here." She looked at the corner. "What?" "There's nothing there." When I looked back, the figure was gone. Just the empty corner, quiet and unthreatening. Emily buried her face in my chest, her small body trembling. "He was here, Daddy. He was here." Julia put a hand on my arm. "What's going on with you two?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't. That night, I moved Emily's bed into our room. She slept curled up between Julia and me, her stuffed bunny squished between her arms. Julia was angry, she thought I was scaring Emily with my paranoia, but I didn't care. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something wasn't right. The room was silent, but the air felt heavy. I turned my head toward the bedroom door. From my position in bed, I could see the mirror down the hall. There was someone standing in front of it. The man. He was closer this time. Almost pressed against the glass. I could see him more clearly now, his face was gaunt, skeletal, with black pits for eyes and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. As I watched, his hand lifted and began to knock on the glass. Slow. Deliberate. Knock. 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 I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The knocks grew louder, reverberating through the house. Then, without warning, the man's head snapped up, and he looked directly at me. I swear to God, he saw me. The glass began to crack. The knocking echoed through the house like the slow beat of a war drum. Knock. 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 I couldn't look away from the mirror, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn. To run. The figure's face remained frozen, that impossibly wide grin stretched across his skeletal mouth, as if he was mocking me. And then, the cracks in the glass began to spread, thin, jagged spiderwebs creeping out from where his hand pressed against the surface. Knock. 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 The sound was impossibly loud now, like it was coming from inside the walls. Julia stirred beside me, groaning softly. Emily remained motionless, her small body curled tight against her stuffed rabbit. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. Silence. I strained to hear anything else, footsteps, whispers, anything, but the house was dead quiet. The mirror at the end of the hall was still cracked, but the figure was gone. The glass was empty. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the frantic thumping of my heart. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, watching the dark hallway like a sentry. The following morning, I went to inspect the mirror. Julia was still angry, still tired from the night before. "This is ridiculous, Mark," she said as I stood in front of it, staring at the cracks in the glass. "You're scaring Emily. You're scaring me." "Look at this," I said, pointing to the fractures that spidered out across the surface. "You see these? This isn't normal. It's an old mirror. It's probably just faulty glass." I ran my fingers across the cracks. They were smooth, almost as if they were inside the glass itself. But what bothered me most was the way they formed strange shapes, patterns that looked eerily like twisted faces and grasping hands. "Why don't we just get rid of it?" I said. "It's not like we paid much for it." Julia folded her arms, exasperated. "Mark, seriously? We're not throwing out a perfectly good antique just because you're stressed." "Stressed?" I turned to her, angry now. "You don't hear the knocking at night? You don't see things?" She frowned, softening a little. "I think you're tired. Work's been a lot lately, and maybe—" "Forget it," I muttered, cutting her off. "I'll deal with it myself." I stormed out of the hallway and grabbed my tools from the garage. If Julia wouldn't get rid of the mirror, I would. I'd smash the damn thing to pieces. When I returned with a hammer in hand, Emily was standing in front of the mirror. Her tiny figure looked so small, so fragile. She stared at the glass as though entranced, her hands limp at her sides. The cracks reflected her image in strange, distorted fragments. "Emily!" I called out, my voice sharp. She didn't move. I rushed toward her, my heart pounding. "Emily!" When I touched her shoulder, she jolted, snapping out of the trance. Her eyes darted to mine, wide and glassy. "Daddy? What were you doing?" I asked, kneeling in front of her. Her bottom lip quivered. I heard someone calling me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Calling you? From where?" She pointed at the mirror. "Who was calling you?" Her little voice dropped to a whisper. "The man. He said I could come play with him." My throat went dry. "Emily, listen to me. You can't talk to him. You can't listen to him, okay?" She nodded, though she didn't seem to understand. I scooped her up in my arms and turned my attention back to the mirror. I was done playing games. "Go to your room," I told her. "I'll take care of this." She scurried down the hallway, glancing back nervously as she disappeared into her room. I stood in front of the mirror, the hammer heavy in my grip. The cracks in the glass seemed deeper now, spreading like veins across its surface. The dark wood frame felt alive, as though it were breathing with me. "I don't know who you are," through gritted teeth, "but you're done here." I raised the hammer and swung with all my strength. The moment the hammer struck the glass, the mirror screamed. Not a sound of shattering glass, no. This was a voice. A guttural, inhuman wail that filled the hallway and rattled the walls. I stumbled backward, dropping the hammer. My ears rang from the sound, and my vision swam. When I looked up, the mirror was intact. The cracks were gone. The surface was smooth, pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. But my reflection didn't move. It stared back at me, unblinking, unbreathing. I lifted my hand instinctively to touch my face, and my reflection did nothing. It just smiled. Slowly. Deliberately. I staggered away, my breath ragged. "No. No, no, no." Behind me, Emily screamed. I sprinted to her room, throwing the door open. Julia was already there, holding Emily as she sobbed into her mother's shoulder. "What happened?" I demanded. Julia glared at me. "You tell me." She said she saw someone in the hallway. I turned back toward the hall, my blood turning cold. The mirror sat there, perfectly still, perfectly whole. But as I looked, something moved in its depths. A flicker of shadow. Julia's voice cut through my thoughts. "This is it, Mark. I want that thing out of the house. Today." I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to. I carried the mirror out to the backyard that afternoon. I didn't care what Julia thought, it had to go. I set it down in the overgrown grass and grabbed the hammer again, my hands shaking. "This ends now," I muttered. I swung the hammer again. And again. And again. Each time, the glass refused to break. The hammer bounced back as if I were hitting solid steel. My arms ached. My chest heaved. I screamed in frustration, slamming the hammer against it one final time. And then, the mirror shifted. The surface rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. My reflection warped and melted into something else, something I didn't want to see. A hand shot out of the glass. It grabbed my wrist, its grip ice-cold and impossibly strong. I screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand held firm. Another hand appeared, pulling itself free of the mirror. And then the man emerged. His face was worse up close, skin pale and stretched tight over his skull, eyes like deep pits, a mouth full of teeth that didn't belong in any human jaw. He grinned, so wide it seemed to split his face in half. "Let me go!" I shouted, thrashing against his grip. He tilted his head, staring at me with empty eyes. Then he whispered, in a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You brought me here." The world spun as he pulled me closer. Closer to the mirror. "Mark." Julia's voice rang out from behind me, but it was too late. The glass rippled again, swallowing me whole. When the glass swallowed me, I expected pain, but there was none. Just a sharp, sinking sensation, as if I'd fallen into icy water. My lungs tightened as the world around me twisted into darkness, and then I was through. The sound of my own ragged breath was deafening. I stumbled, landing hard on what felt like stone. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was standing in a long, shadowy corridor. The walls were mirrors. They stretched into infinity in both directions, their frames twisted and black, like the one in my hallway. The air felt thick and stagnant, a chill biting into my skin. Every time I moved, the mirrors reflected my movements, but each reflection was wrong. Slightly delayed. Slightly distorted. "Where am I?" I muttered, my voice thin and hollow. I turned slowly, searching for anything, anyone. The man who dragged me here was gone. I was alone. Or so I thought. As I stepped forward, I caught movement in the mirrors. My reflections froze one by one, each of them turning their heads to watch me. Their eyes gleamed darkly, their mouths twitching with anticipation. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. "This isn't real. It's not real." One of the reflections smiled. "Not me. Just it. You shouldn't have come here, Mark." The voice wasn't mine. It sounded like something dead trying to speak. Low and brittle, it reverberated from every surface. I turned to run, but the mirrors seemed to close in, twisting the corridor into a maze. No matter which way I turned, I saw him. The man. His tall, crooked figure loomed behind the glass, following me from mirror to mirror. He never moved quickly, just a slow, deliberate step every time I looked away. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice quivered with fear. He didn't listen. He kept moving closer, the grin on his face stretching impossibly wide. I ran. I don't know how long I ran for, minutes, hours. Time didn't feel real in that place. My footsteps echoed endlessly, and the mirrors stretched on forever, trapping me in a loop of my own reflection. Finally, I skidded to a stop, chest heaving. My legs ached. Sweat dripped down my face, but the cold air around me chilled it before it could fall. "Think, Mark. Think," I muttered. There has to be a way out. And that's when I saw her. In one of the mirrors to my left, a small figure appeared, a child, curled in the corner of a dark room. "Emily?" I whispered, stepping closer. She looked up slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and tear-streaked. "Daddy?" Her voice cracked, faint and echoing, as though it had traveled a long way to reach me. "Emily!" I shouted, pressing my hands to the cold glass. "I'm here. I'm right here." She stood up, her stuffed rabbit hanging limply in her hand. "You need to come back, Daddy." "I'm trying. Tell me how to get out." Her mouth opened to speak, but then her gaze shifted past me, and her eyes widened in terror. "He's coming." I spun around. The man was there. Only a few feet away now. His grin split his face like a wound, his black eyes fixed on me. His long fingers twitched at his sides, hungry and reaching. "Stay away!" I shouted. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows against stone. "You don't belong here," he rasped, his voice a dry, splintered whisper. "But now you're mine." He lunged. I dove to the side just in time, crashing hard into the nearest mirror. The glass rippled under my weight, but didn't break. My reflection stared back at me, its mouth moving on its own. "Break it," it whispered. "What?" I choked out, clutching my aching shoulder. "Break the mirror. Get out." The man was already recovering, his long arms dragging him upright. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed a loose shard of glass from the floor, it was heavy and jagged, cold as ice. I lifted it high and slammed it against the nearest mirror. The glass exploded. The sound of shattering mirrors was deafening, like 1,000 windows breaking at once. I shielded my face as shards rained down around me, slicing at my arms and hands. And then everything shifted. The mirrors cracked and fell away, disintegrating into a swirling, inky darkness. The corridor warped and twisted like a living thing, collapsing in on itself. I felt myself being pulled backward, as if by invisible hands, dragged through the blackness toward some unseen light. "No!" the man screamed, his voice echoing in rage. "You can't escape me." I squeezed my eyes shut as the force yanked me through the void, faster and faster, until I hit the floor. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on my back in the upstairs hallway. My head throbbed, my body ached, and I gasped as though I'd been underwater for hours. The mirror lay beside me, shattered into dozens of pieces. Its dark frame was splintered and broken, the wood curling like burnt flesh. "Mark!" Julia's voice pulled me back to reality. She stood at the end of the hallway, Emily clutched tightly in her arms. Both of them looked pale and terrified. "Are you okay?" Julia cried, rushing to my side. I sat up slowly, wincing. My hands were cut and bleeding, small shards of glass embedded in my palms. I think so." Emily's eyes were locked on the broken mirror. "Is he gone?" she whispered. I followed her gaze. For a moment, I swore I saw movement in the largest shard of glass, a shadow slinking deeper into the blackness. But then it was gone. "I don't know," I said quietly. "But it's over." We didn't waste any time. That afternoon, I gathered the broken pieces of the mirror and took them outside. Julia and Emily watched from the kitchen window as I built a fire in the backyard. I threw the shards into the flames, one by one. As each piece hit the fire, I heard faint, agonized whispers, as if the mirror itself was screaming. The smoke that rose from it was black and thick, curling into unnatural shapes before finally dissipating. By sunset, nothing remained of the mirror but ash. That night, I tucked Emily into bed. She clung to her stuffed rabbit and looked up at me with tired eyes. "Is the bad man gone, Daddy?" I stroked her hair gently. "Yeah, sweetheart. He's gone. Will he come back?" I hesitated, glancing at her bedroom mirror, a small, ordinary thing that hung on her closet door. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker across its surface. But when I looked closer, it was just my reflection. "No," I said finally, kissing her forehead. "He won't come back." Emily nodded sleepily, curling up beneath her blankets. As I turned out the light and closed her door, I whispered a silent promise to myself. No more mirrors.